2018 has been declared by many as the kind of the year of the enterprise blockchain, with the hope that large firms across a variety of industries will move from kind of POC stage to large-scale deployment. We could not have had a better panel than this one to discuss how this future will materialize, what use cases we will gravitate to, and what are some of the challenges that the industry is struggling with. I'm a finance professor, not a technologist, so my questions are going to be generally at a higher level, trying to understand the economics involved here. Feel free to answer questions that you're most passionate about, right? So, and I hope that we have free-flowing discussion. We're going to have time for Q&A toward the end of the panel. Now, I'm going to start with a question that probably everyone wants to hear the answer to, which is at a high level, what are the key advantages blockchain has for enterprises, and what are some of the use cases that you are most excited about?
I'll start.
Go ahead. Alum's first.
So in terms of the key advantages for blockchain, I think there's a couple of things. First and foremost is the concept of immutability. So that means it's tamper-proof. Corporations are constantly trading data back and forth, but any of you who've ever worked in a large corporation know that that can sometimes just be an Excel spreadsheet, right? And that those spreadsheets sometimes capture the most important data that a company has. And so being able to have an immutable record of all of that data is critical. That's first. The second is around the concept of finality. So once a transaction gets committed to the blockchain, it is final. It has happened. In the real world, and Ron probably knows this better than most, but transactions in capital markets can take T+2, T+3, T+21 days to get processed. And when you think about the currency risk, the settlement risk, I mean, there's tremendous amount of risk there. So when I think about some of the key use cases that make sense for blockchain, it's places where there are multiple entities that need to share information and that need to be able to transact in a way that allows them to share that in a private and controlled way. And I think blockchain in an enterprise context provides a lot of opportunity for that. So financial services, supply chain, even government and healthcare, I think, are really critical areas.
Yeah, I would just expand probably on the supply chain aspects of this. Everything that, by the way, everything that we do in supply chain today, probably, even though we've had standards like EDI since the 70s, and even systems for EDI, which is just a data interchange protocol, there's probably about 70% of our supply chains are run on Excel spreadsheets and email today, which, as you can imagine, is an administrative nightmare. Not only are you dealing with multiple records of the truth, but you're also dealing with emails passing in the night, and which is the most current version. Send me the latest spreadsheet. I mean, as if anybody's who has tried to do multi-document editing and using email as the way to send versions back and forth, just imagine that and trying to run your inventory in your business. That is the state of many physical supply chains today. So as we look at this example where essentially those separate databases that are bound by enterprise firewalls and legal contracts within those walls, if you can now open that up into an environment where you actually can share the same records and the same state of truth about that inventory, you completely remove this need to do this reconciliation that's happening on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So what's actually happening in supply chain is that we're actually recodifying all of the business rules associated with how we interchange data about inventory and about the finances associated with inventory for the first time in a long time, because what's happened up until now is that companies kept adding people to solve this problem, not just in the supply chain, but also in financial services, where essentially there's large pools of people and their entire job is reconciliation. And reconciliation exists because of these multiple sources of the truth. So that is a fundamental quality that blockchain brings to enterprises, whether it's running in the public or private or in a consortium. If there's multiple parties looking at a single record of truth, changes how we actually negotiate at the end of every month in an advertising market, for example. So you're talking about digital assets, physical assets, cross industries, from advertising to Walmart to essentially every time you're trying to track an asset, there's an opportunity to do that better using the qualities of blockchain.
And let me just jump in with am I on? Sorry. Let me just jump in with an example. IBM has a commercial financing business, and we actually implemented blockchain for dispute resolution, and were able to find $250 million in working capital because we were able to take the time that it takes to resolve a dispute from 60 days down to less than 2 weeks. And that was a tremendous impact that our CFO saw and said, absolutely, move forward.
Yeah. I would, so I fully agree with everything, Kathryn, you're saying, and Yorke. I'd expand a little bit on the knock-on benefit of those benefits, which is cost. When you look at the reconciliation challenges across financial markets, if you had any idea how sloppy reconciliations are across multiple economic sectors, your hair would fall out.
Well, we have good examples of that.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and there are real costs associated with the reconciliations across multiple industries, and sometimes they still get it wrong. There is diminishing return to throwing resource people at reconciliation. So you see that kind of realized cost benefit. And I think one of the kind of out of the air estimates was banking would save $20 billion a year or something, some out of the air estimate that someone put together that I don't have any real reason to doubt. I absolutely agree with the supply chain use case in our mind, and we're the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance, and a lot of our focus is global markets, but you can't have that in isolation. Mm-hmm. So it's a supply chain conversation. It's an insurance conversation. And so we're very privileged to speak to organizations across that. I think supply chain, particularly food supply chain, really is in need of the benefits of that blockchain offers, and I think identity is one of the real benefits that we're starting to hone in on, both from the socioeconomic impact of it when you look at unbanked and underbanked, as well as even at the enterprise level. Pick any large organization, and they've probably got 17, 20, 50 different faces of that organization, and now you have the challenges of economic value transfer and reconciliation all over again.
Well, I also think that if you look at you mentioned a lot of really important things, one of which is identity. Both Microsoft and IBM are doing a lot of work in the identity space because we recognize the transformative value of how to do this right. And blockchain is a technology which allows us to, as was said earlier, recapture control of our personal data back to the consumer. And to the extent that large enterprises then can take advantage of knowing who that person is without actually capturing all of their data, that's a huge benefit to society as a whole. But it also is a huge benefit to those corporations, because the reality is, as we've seen with all of these breaches, is that data is a liability for those corporations. But just taking a step back in terms of inventory, the financial opportunity with inventory, and identity, and all of these things rely on the concept of digitization or tokenization. And we're not talking about ICOs, we're talking about digitizing assets such that we can uniquely track them, and that opens up entirely new opportunities in terms of liquidity in markets that don't have any liquidity today because those assets are not digitized. So that is transformative when at the basic level, when you start to uniquely identify goods, that opens up entirely new markets.
Can we make a promise not to talk about ICOs?
Yes.
None of my questions are on ICOs. So kind of drilling down into this, if I'm an enterprise, what would be kind of the checklist that I would go through, if you will, or the thought process of thinking about whether kind of enterprise blockchain is right for me relative to maybe other solutions that are out there?
Yeah, so let me jump in, because I think this is a little known fact, but IBM actually started with Ethereum. That's how we did our first blockchain projects. And we ran into a couple of key problems, and I think they really start to identify the problems or the requirements that any enterprise would need. So first and foremost, we weren't able to scale in Ethereum. And so having a platform that you can actually scale to the volumes, transaction processing speeds, et cetera, that you're going to need for enterprise is critical. So that's first. The second thing is we had a lot of suggestions and wanted to actually change the code base. But there wasn't a simple, straightforward way to do that. You basically have to call up Vitalik and convince him that that's what you want to do.
Well, not quite.
Good luck with that.
But anyway, so what we really wanted to make sure is that the technology itself has an open governance model. So that's why Hyperledger Project is part of the Linux Foundation, because they have 20 years of managing open source projects, and there's a very clear process for getting changes or updates made if you want that to happen. The governance is important at the technology level, but it's also important for the solution level. When you think about having all of these multiple organizations that are going to come together and share data, you need to have rules around who can join the network, who can add a smart contract, who can trade assets, et cetera. That's really important. And that leads to the next point, where it is around security. You're only as secure as your weakest link. So you need to make sure that whatever technology you're using, you can really embed the security that you require around it, because a lot of these industries, especially financial services, healthcare, and government, have very stringent regulations. So blockchain presents an incredible opportunity, but you've got to be able to meet the regulatory requirements, and that's got to be something that blockchain can deliver for you.
Yeah, I think in terms of, you certainly want to stay today, you want to stay away from things that will have a regulatory impact, because it's going to slow you down, right? So that's sort of a qualification, right? You cannot do anything that touches a regulatory impact. But that leaves actually quite a large landscape of opportunity within a large multinational enterprise like an IBM or Microsoft or a GE or others. And so then you start to look at, well, what makes a good business case? And I will caution you that the worst person to do an evaluation of a blockchain decentralized solution is an existing IT person who understands databases and IT technology, because the answer will be 90% of the time will be, we can do this in a database, right? And that's just IT behavior, right? It's like, I know what to do with this thing, and I don't have any idea what to do with this thing, so this is my solution, right? And that's how we operate, right? So that is an important thing to understand in terms of how you're evaluating from a process perspective. Multi-party interests, reconciliation problems, lack of trust, or contractual agreements that create trust are good areas to look in. And then certainly looking at, how do I scale this thing to meet the needs of this particular business problem? One of the things that I think there's been a lot of focus on is scaling at the database or at the block transaction level. But if you look at most enterprise systems today, or look at the web, for example, or any internet e-commerce application, there are many, many layers of scale and scale technologies that go into the end solution, right? We didn't say, I'm going to build my e-commerce system on a SQL Server database. We said, I'm going to build my e-commerce system on a database, plus an inventory system, plus a content management system, plus caching servers, plus load balancing servers, in order to get the scale that allows us to do e-commerce transactions. So that same type of layered approach is what we will see in terms of enterprise systems around blockchain. Blockchain for sure brings new qualities to the picture, and there are certain choke points, but we build systems around those to actually solve for those choke points.
So when you're part of a trade association, you get into this weird space. And I usually every week get the phone call from a colleague across some industry vertical, and they say, we're going to do a blockchain, which always just drives me bananas. To the point of your question,
Yeah.
and absolutely agreeing with everything Kathryn and Yorke are mentioning, is this kind of core first principles, right? I'm not a deep technologist. I've just managed enough technology teams to ask astoundingly dumb questions. But what are you trying to accomplish, and what problem do you think you're trying to solve, versus the how do you actually do what you do?
Okay.
And pick any large organization. There are a lot of layers to peel back. And some of it's messy, and some of it's old, some of it needs to evolve, some of it does the job. So I always go back to that core principle when someone says, how do we get involved? How do we implement? My first question really is why? and what problem do you think you're trying to solve versus what the real problems are for your industry?
And that is actually what's most important about blockchain. Everybody is so excited about the technology. And yes, the technology is cool, but at the heart of it, it's actually transforming business and how different parties interact. So you really, to Ron's point, you've got to get around the why, not just for yourself, but then for all the other entities that might want to be part of that network. There has to be a benefit for them. And then blockchain, as Yorke mentioned, is not going to replace every system, certainly not anytime soon. So you've got to make sure that you can actually integrate what you're going to do with the blockchain. And you're only going to want to put the smallest amount of information possible onto the chain. And then you're going to have to integrate out with all of the other systems that continue to run your day-to-day business. And I think that's really critical.
So you mentioned kind of cultural, if you will, clashes with sort of standard IT. It seems to me from what you guys are describing is that the maybe behind the scene conversation is a lot deeper, right? I mean, it sounds like companies that really take this seriously, in some ways, change their culture, right? I mean, it's sort of much more collaborative, much more open way of doing business compared to how they do it today. I mean, is this something that's showing up in the conversation?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I mean, technology is fundamentally a cross-silo technology. Right. If you look at most of the interest or what's driven the interest, it hasn't been from IT departments up. It's been from executive line of businesses down. And that is because of the transformative qualities of the technology. And I, to your point, Kathryn, I think when we think about how do we realize the potential business value, well, before we even touch code or technology, that's a business analysis skill, right? Mm-hmm. And there are many, many people who we need in this industry to do business analysis, right? Not just the technology layer. And I think that is actually what really, really cracks the nut, because there are fundamental opportunities to dramatically transform internal and external businesses if we look at them and really study them and study the qualities of decentralization. And yeah, it's a social change inside of enterprises as well, for sure.
And one of the things that we actually do when clients are interested, when companies they say, okay, I want to use blockchain, I have a use case, I have a why, we take them out of their offices. We literally go to a space that we call the Blockchain Garage, and it is where we run design thinking workshops, and it just helps them get out of, this is how I behave and act every day. And we've found that that's essential to get them to actually imagine a world where they're sitting next to their arch enemy competitor and figuring out how to move forward. And I think that is one of the big shifts that blockchain really pushes.
Yeah, and it talks about, one of the things we often discuss is, blockchain is part of this kind of meta trend around the evolution of technology and innovation. Every one of us had conversations 10, 15 more years ago, and if you said open source, get out, right? That's not happening, but it's happening, and it happens across the entire global ecosystem. Blockchain's part of that. Blockchain is another evolution in that idea of decentralization and co-opetition across counterparties. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, and that was mentioned, open source, blockchain as a prime example of something that's driving open source. I say the same thing, I heard that earlier in the conversation, is that in the many years that we've been supportive and IBM's been supportive of open source, I think blockchain has really accelerated the value proposition that people are seeing with the speed of iteration of the technology. It's quite astounding. So
talking a little bit about the challenges in deployment, I mean, there are many, and we could probably talk about this for a very long time, but let me mention two. One is scalability, and the other one is sort of this issue of privacy and information sharing. And in particular, so I'll make two comments, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about them. The first is that it seems to me like there's an inherent trade-off between the size of the network, even if it's obviously private blockchain, and its performance, right? So do you see this as a sort of inherent conflict or inherent friction, and how should we go about sort of thinking about solving it? The second is that companies are obviously cautious about sharing information with competitors for various reasons. But as an economist, when I look at it, I think, well, geez, that's a pretty convenient, or could be a very convenient way of actually helping companies collude, because now they share information with each other, and without sharing information, there's no way for us to enforce collusion. Is this something that we should think about this as a sort of a regulatory risk? So I'll let you guys take any of the comments or ignore them as being idiosyncratic.
We're going to ignore that entire question.
Okay, good. So I'll move on to the next one.
No, I'll jump in. So I think the Bitcoin, the Ethereum worlds, they imagine a world where everyone is anonymous, but everything is public, right? But we live in a world that actually is the opposite, right? So you know who you're transacting with, right? You're not going to go buy a car, a computer, or anything from someone that you don't have some level of trust with, right? But then you want the actual, the value or the contents of that transaction to be private, because you don't necessarily want to publicize to the entire market, all your friends and everybody on planet Earth, how much you paid for your car or your house, although maybe you do. But so when we thought about what blockchain needed to do, we really have made that switch. So that's where what IBM does with the Hyperledger projects is really around knowing who's in the network, but then making sure that the actual transactions themselves are private. And there's actually a couple of different ways that you can do that in the technology itself. And this comes back to the question about you have to figure out the business problem, right? So we have a concept of private ledgers where you can have a small subset of the broader network that are transacting. They've also just introduced point-to-point messaging, so you don't actually even have to necessarily have a ledger that you're going to share data across. And that really helps to your question about scalability, because then you can actually scale in the areas that you need to, rather than having to have every single participant have all of that data on a single ledger. And I think the other key thing is that there is a record of every transaction. So while not everyone can see it, if a regulator needs to go in, you can actually revert to the existing legal system to figure out who did what when. And then you can continue to use the legal system as necessary, as business expects to today.
So I think if you look at you're asking sort of a network effects problem. And that is an important consideration. I mean, imagine if you were trying to get, like people have heard the term groupthink or committee decision making. It's very hard to get anywhere fast, right, when you have a relatively sizable committee. And I mean, consensus algorithms solve that problem through code. And I think that is an important aspect of these consortium networks, which are basically a private network among agreed set of parties. Which we'll get to, I think, governance in a moment. But I think one of the important things, you mentioned this idea of peer-to-peer transactions and things like that. Don't mistake that for not still needing to have a solid record of what happened that can be validated. Because if you think that, I'm not saying you do, but just to make sure that the audience sees the distinction and importance here, if you go back to what I said earlier about tokenization of assets, if I want to tokenize this chair, everyone has to recognize that this chair, whether it's inside my enterprise or it's sold to me from a manufacturer, was tokenized, has a specific identity, and we can track that, right? So that means there is a ledger that maintains the history of this, just like we have in a Bitcoin sense or an Ethereum sense. So that is an important aspect even inside an enterprise, because you cannot track goods and assets without being able to identify them uniquely and not being able to double spend. Now, physically in a chair, it's a little hard to do double spending, but if you have digital assets, it is very easy, as we've seen on the internet, to double spend, right? Because I can just copy, an advertising or a text from your blog and put it on my blog, right? That's double spending, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have this conversation a lot with our members and within the board and the working groups, and it's really this conversation around it's the governance conversation in many regards, and it's I'll take an almost philosophic focus on it for a split second. We don't live in a decentralized world. Everyone just wants us to live in a decentralized world and doesn't understand the implications of living in a decentralized world. So the solution, at least in any foreseeable future, is not going to be full distributed, fully decentralized. We are all our own banks and we all maintain our own information. If for no other reason, then most people don't want to and wouldn't know how to. The one thing I would just add to that is, and we had mentioned this outside when we were talking, there are many parts of our global world and our ecosystem that need to evolve, not just the technology, and governance is one of them. And I agree with you, and I think we were talking about this earlier. Not enough effort is being spent on what do governance models need to be in a distributed ledger blockchain world, and who defines engagement within any particular ecosystem. And it goes back to the education conversation we often have. There's still so much learning that needs to be done. The why of governance.
Absolutely.
What are you governing and why are you doing it that way? And that'll inform what that governance looks like in the future.
So that leads us very nicely into my next question, which is, well, again, when I think about this at kind of an abstract level, I think of these private blockchains as essentially a consortium of entities creating some public utility for themselves, right? So it's not open, it's not public in a permissionless sense, but it serves them. How should we think about the distribution of value that is being created as a result of that, whether it's accrued to that utility versus distributed across members, and how that interacts with governance, right? I mean, and very, like, you know, again, this is my non-technical background thing, but if I'm part of that network and we have this utility and that utility fails, right? So we find that there's a big breach in that utility. Who do I turn to? Like, who's responsible for that malfunction, right?
But isn't that an architecture conversation? Really, what private blockchain are you architecting? Who's part of it? How's it administered, and why?
Okay.
Fundamentally.
Well, I think there's two things. We're in the early 90s of internet, maybe late 80s, right? Where you have these groups that are figuring out, how do I use blockchain? What are the implications? Not only how do I do the technology, but how do I do the business? How is the governance? How is this going to change my industry? And what we're starting to see is some of our first clients that have done initial POCs, MVPs, et cetera, they're now taking that and starting to apply it not just to perhaps their first use case, but to their second, to their third, to their fourth. And I think because with each use case, they learn more about how does that governance actually need to work. And what we're starting to see is connections from one network to another as these groups understand how it works, they set governance, and they need to transact. As I think Yorke mentioned, no company is in one single industry ever, right? Because every company, regardless of the industry, has to deal with the banking system, has to deal with the government, has to deal with labor regulations, et cetera. And so what we're starting to see is how the enterprise can start to use blockchain across multiple use cases and start to connect to other networks that have evolved. So I think we're going to see a lot of really interesting developments in the next probably 6 to 9 months. IBM made a big announcement earlier this week about joining the Sovereign Foundation, and we're going to run the Sovereign nodes. We're going to start to see much more connection across the different networks, and governance is critical to that, because before I can put Yorke's chair on a blockchain, we got to make sure that everybody agrees that it is a chair, to Yorke's point, and the rules of trading that chair, right? And so those are some of the key pieces that, frankly, are moving at the speed of humans rather than technology.
Right. Yeah, and I think if you look at how progress is made, it's usually made in one, fits and starts, and two, you have smaller groups who get together because it's more efficient, right? And then those smaller groups realize that there's some valuable connection to another group, and then they create some type of connection, hopefully in the technology that helps with that. But I think, and you also mentioned collusion, which is an interesting problem. I think the theory is that if there's enough parties in the network, that the appropriate consensus model would avoid collusion. But if you actually, and I was discussing this with my son when we were driving to San Antonio a couple weeks ago, for about 2 hours. We had a three-party example, and it's actually a very simple example that's actually hard to solve. It was basically a seller who wants to sell a good, like a chair, and a courier who's going to actually carry the chair, and a buyer who purchased the chair on an e-commerce marketplace. How do you actually solve the ownership of that chair during its transit such that it successfully moves through the network without credit, right? Because we're talking about tokens, right? So there's not a credit market for that. And how do you do that without collusion between those three parties? Because you could always have two of those parties collude against the third. And it's very hard to solve that with three parties. So you have to have enough people in the network to avoid collusion. And I think that's the demonstration that we see with Ethereum and Bitcoin, right? They've demonstrated that enough people in the network creates a secure environment because with at least the 51% consensus model, you can't get collusion in that environment.
Yeah, and I think that ties to the evolution of the idea of utilities, potentially for certain ecosystem engagements. That three-party solution is not an easy solution. If governance ordains a utility that helps to define that this is a chair and we'll custody the chair, which is kind of an odd thing to do, you begin to see how you can start solving some of those problems. But they're not easy problems to solve in many regards.
Well, and custody is a great example. You mentioned risk and failure. I mean, today we solve risk and failure with insurance, right? Because we have custody of assets, right? Because we have escrow and we have all these other instruments, right, to solve for those failures, which we have to now remodel, right, in these consortium environments. And this is another area that's fundamentally underinvested is, you mentioned identity. I mean, when we're talking about things like sovereign and decentralized identities and human identities and refugee identities, that's as valuable as money, right? And you know, these particular types of keys can hold both, right? Your identity and your value. So actually solving for custody solves both of those problems, right? Keeping humans safe, right, from bad regimes, and keeping money safe, right? So custody is a huge area that needs to be solved. Better than it's solved today.
What role, if any, do you see for native coins in private blockchains? There's a bit of some people have passionate views about this. I'm curious to hear yours.
Well, I mean, I'll go back to the token example. There's tremendous value in digitization of assets. And to the extent that you can use something called a token or a key to identify a good, which is what a token is, and create logic around different behaviors, whether it's consumption of the good or transfer of ownership of the good, even within a corporation, this is extremely valuable. So the idea that you need tokens inside of a private network is actually important, and they're there, right? Because they are the private keys. It's just how you use them. Do you actually go the next step, which is I think what you're saying, which is actually take a token and associate it with money? That's another question. But we do see many examples of that today. If you look at Starbucks rewards points, airline points, right? Those are tokens that actually get converted into money at some point in time. So they do actually have the possibility to convert, right?
And part of what's necessary to make these ecosystems work is you have to have incentives. There has to be some benefit for people to partake, right? And so beyond just digitizing physical or other assets, you can also, to the point around loyalty points, as an example, you can use tokens to incent behavior in a specific network. So if you, and I think that when you look at what Hyperledger Fabric is doing, they're actually putting a native token asset model in the next version. There's ways that you can do that already with technologies like Hyperledger Composer. And we're seeing more and more enterprises that as they learn and understand the basics, make sure they've hit the regulatory hurdles, et cetera, they're going to start to experiment with not only how do we digitize specific assets, but then how do we incent members of our community to transact and participate.
And so kind of solves a way of solving the coordination problem, right? Like,
Exactly.
And digging into that loyalty and rewards points example, which is billions of dollars globally, but there's also a financial and legal aspect to that. And so loyalty rewards points for most corporations sit as deferred liabilities on the books and records of those companies. So there's true financial impact. And then you get to the legal and regulatory question around redemption and value. When you see a reward, something it'll say this can be redeemed for 1/1,000,000th of a penny. So it ultimately is governance. What's the value of the redemption and transfer of that token, and who defines that? Yep. And again, it goes right to the heart of what we were mentioning earlier, which is we're under-investing in the governance conversation, not just for financial markets, but loyalty and rewards points. And some of the examples we're starting to see, look overseas, look at what Dubai's doing, where they're working to leverage blockchain and tokenization to incent behavior around tourism, around, they just started something, certainly loyalty and rewards, even healthcare. They're beginning to work on models leveraging blockchain and tokens to incent citizens to go to the gym, go for a walk, do things. So, and you need governance and structure around that.
Well, and I think that, when you talk about enterprise blockchain opportunity, I would posit that first of all, this is a journey, right? We fundamentally believe that we're on a journey to somewhere, and enterprises will always start in their comfort zone, right? And it's our job to help those enterprises start and keep going, right, as technologists. And the outcome of the journey has probably been defined by the public blockchain markets. And I think the realization of adding a token into Hyperledger and adding a token back into Quorum are realizations that, hey, there's real value in actually having a token. Whether it carries real currency value or not, there's value in having a token as part of the network.
At least the capability,
yes,
for sure.
Right.
So leading off of that, the World Economic Forum projected that 10% of world GDP is going to be stored on blockchain technology within the next 10 years, okay, which is pretty grand vision, everyone would agree. So what are some of the critical junctions in your view that would determine whether that ambitious goal is attained or not? It's a toughie. I know it's kind of being a futuristic.
But I mean, that goes back to our governance and regulation conversation, right? I definitely see a world where you have central bank digital currencies. That is going to happen. And the question is going to be time and how humans and different organizations can actually make that real, right? So having the right governance, having the right regulatory regime so they don't step in to squash innovation is going to be critical. And making sure that things like security, et cetera, are maintained so that you don't have a major, whether it be hack, denial of service attack, or something else that majorly derails the credibility. And I think that's why we've been really committed to permission blockchain, because you have you have more control and more ability to manage that.
Yeah, and I would also say that the world of permission blockchain is very much like the world of the intranet, right, in the early 90s, when enterprises were certainly doing lots with TCP/IP, or at least after sort of mid 90s, I guess, with TCP/IP. Before that, it was NetWare. But the idea of having an internal company network where you can build protected business systems is sort of where we are in enterprise blockchain, right? It's a comfort area for enterprises, right, to engage without feeling at risk. And I think if you go back to my point about digitization and tokenization, that fundamentally is doing exactly what we're talking about, where you're taking real assets, right, and you're representing them, and where they get stored or represented or placed is I think a question, but it is happening because there's a value in doing that, right? And so I think that will actually happen probably a lot faster than we realize, as people realize the value of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. Although when I hear stats like 10% of global GDP, I think people are forgetting what a heavy lift that would be. And one of the, just to abstract a little bit away from that, is we still don't see that kind of last mile or integration for the mass of humanity to be engaged in these global systems that are blockchain-powered systems. And I'm not talking about the behind-the-scenes, the plumbing of Wall Street or the plumbing of banking, but to have 10% of global GDP be on blockchain requires a whole hell of a lot more people to be involved in blockchain.
Well, how do you define 10% of global GDP?
Off of a WEF report that he was
I
reading.
don't know how they define that.
No, but it goes to the point that you need not just the technologists, but you need the bankers, the lawyers, everyone,
people.
the product
A whole
people. I
ecosystem.
mean, it really is
Yeah.
the whole ecosystem.
So let me just conclude with the following question. I mean, there's a large number of students in the audience. They obviously care about their career and how they're going to build their human capital. So if someone graduating 2018, speaking of the ecosystem, what advice do you have for someone who wants to enter into this space?
I would just say learn as much as you can and find the part of blockchain that you're excited about. So if you're a law student, think about the aspects of smart contracts and regulation. If you're an engineer, dive into the code. If you're an MBA, call me, please. And we need business analysis and business analysts to actually make this real. This space is still so new, but it is completely transforming the economy. So there are incredible opportunities really across the whole spectrum at everything from the tiniest startups to the largest enterprises.
Yeah, I mean, I started in this space personally in 2015, and well, when I actually started getting interested in it. I have actually been teaching about Bitcoin in my e-commerce class for a number of years, but I never got interested in it because I wasn't reading about the technology, and I'm more of a technologist than a financier. But when I did get interested in it, I was able to quantify very clearly how much time I spent, and it literally took me 6 months, almost full-time, on top of my full-time job. So this is an important thing to think about as well, is you're going to go out into the workforce and you're going to work. You are going to have to spend more time to pursue your passion, especially earlier in your career. So I spent 40 hours a week, literally for 6 months, before I was comfortable to go talk to Vanessa's boss, Joe Lubin, and actually have an intelligible conversation about what is blockchain and what's the value that Microsoft could bring in the blockchain ecosystem. And the other part of that discussion is it still takes me about a week every week to stay up to date on what's going on. And so this is an incredibly powerful technology and so much going on, and it's very much like the early days of the internet. And you just have to read. And by reading, you will discover areas that really fascinate you, and you'll keep going down that part of the rabbit hole. And so I think that's the most important thing, is just keep learning. And I'm pretty old, and it fascinates me, right? It's like my opportunity for the next 10 plus years in my career to completely pivot what I'm doing.
Yeah, agreed. Keep learning, lots to read. Don't think, to your point, if you read something, we're seeing a lot of this, right? Someone will read a whole bunch of papers on blockchain and suddenly start marketing themselves as blockchain consultants, which really kind of terrifies me. Don't think if you read a bunch that you can stop and suddenly you've got a grasp. To your point, it's evolving faster in some instances and in some respects than the internet that we knew over the past 20, 30 years. If you're a business person, find a technologist and help them understand the implications of the technology and understand use cases. I think people should spend more time on that. If you're a technologist, stop telling business students and business people they don't know what they're talking about and they don't get it, because they get it. They're trying to understand how it means their world's evolving.
Excellent. So we have time for some questions from the audience.
In enterprise, often the thing that is in opposition to immutability is record retention, disposal, and maybe redacting. Is there a logical solution for that blockchain gets that case?
Yeah, so once a transaction is committed to the ledger, you cannot remove it, because if you do, you break the chain and you can't commit anything else to that ledger. So now over time, we're going to have ledger pruning and archiving, right? Because a company is basically responsible or liable for any of the data that it holds. So that's an area where we're already seeing some experimenting starting to happen. And that ties to some of the challenges that some of the public blockchains have with replicating this entire ledger.
Right.
Imagine when we're 50 years down the line what that's going to take. But I think that's absolutely, when we talk to large accounting firms and regulators, they are thrilled that there is no way that you can change the transaction.
Yeah.
If you want to change the transaction, you have to add another transaction to undo it, basically.
The redaction thing is actually really interesting when you look at it from the perspective of governmental records. And I don't know the answer, but it'll be interesting to see how blockchain develops to manage redaction that's required for disclosures in some instances.
Well,
and how do you redact an immutable record, right?
Well, I think it goes to, first of all, people think everything gets stored on blockchain, right? And someone referred to it earlier as a database. It's not a database, right? Blockchain is much more like an index than it is a database. And it's a sequenced in time index. And so to the extent that you obfuscate off-chain storage data, you would have an opportunity to quote unquote redact based on permissions, essentially. So there are opportunities to sort of work around
And now we're back to governance and permissions.
But we have an immediate challenge, though. GDPR is rolling out in Europe May 25th, I believe. And so that is something that is going to immediately impact the blockchain space in ways that I don't think people necessarily realize. Part of it, to Yorke's point, is what data do you put on the blockchain or not? But we're looking at how you start to handle some of those scenarios.
Simple question. What do you read?
Everything.
Yeah, everything.
I don't read Reddit.
I would say you read you do. That's why I said everything, because you read the internet, right? So Medium is actually a great source. Reddit's really hard to read, but some people are fans of Reddit. And blogs, and yes, you have to read the CoinDesk dailies and things like that. But realize that different, not saying anything about CoinDesk, but realize that different news sources have certain biases. So you do want to read multiple sources. But Medium's actually a fairly decent place to find real people talking about deep concepts. But yes, you have to read everything.
And there's probably 15 or 20 people that I follow on Twitter that are constantly pointing to some of the best content, and they're having the most important discussions. And so I think that's really finding some of the people that you're most interested in is another way to help kind of wade through that kind of ocean of content.
And there's wonderful books and authors out there, stuff that's been published over the last 2 years by fairly well-known authors, both in the space and who have come into the space. The challenge, and books are awesome, right? I have a stack of them, right? But the challenge is, as I said before, every single week we're dealing with 10, 15, 20, 50 new things that books very quickly become outdated. It's a good starting point, but it won't keep you up to date at all.
Yeah. Parse through Twitter, though, right? Because there's a lot of junk.
Absolutely. That's why
Yeah.
select.
Yep.
One thing, have you guys tried pitching to government bodies about the different use cases of blockchain and what kind of traction have you seen from them? Also, do you get inbound queries from them?
Yes,
Absolutely.
and yes.
Yes. So IBM is working with governments all over the world. We announced a major partnership with Dubai. We see all parts of government, from like central banks, regulators, healthcare agencies, are all interested in how do you use this technology. And we're seeing the volumes that are coming in are really pretty tremendous.
Governments are just microcosms of the rest of the economy, right? So you have supply chains, you have procurement organizations, you have finance organizations, you have regulatory bodies. All the same use cases apply. It's just they're slightly different, right? So I might want to do, for example, let's say I'm a Navy carrier in the middle of the ocean and I'm not going back to port and I need a part and I have a 3D printer on board. How do I validate that the 3D AutoCAD drawing has not been tampered with? Right? That's an example of digitization. It is a digital asset. How do we ensure that that digital asset was not tampered with? Right? I want to take a design and print it. Right? So that's just one simple example in one specific use case.
Yeah, we get the opportunity. As a trade association, we're not selling software, but so we have conversations with regulators on a fairly regular basis, particularly focused on financial markets. One of the other interesting conversations that have really begun to develop for us is other trade associations representing industry that have been around for a long time. So we've partnered with AICPA talking about accountants. They have 700,000 members worldwide trying to understand what the heck is, everything from what the heck is a blockchain to, oh my God, some of our clients leverage blockchain technology for value transfer, or we have a client that had made a whole bunch of money on Bitcoin and they got a tax bill. What the hell do we do? So yes and yes.
Should we? Vivek, you're the boss. We have maybe room for one more question. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to know, given the pervasive nature of this technology as you guys are describing, what sort of testing methodology / frameworks have you guys come up with or are envisioning in order to make sure that we don't keep forking, or we ensure that the trust doesn't weaken in the system because we found a bug and now it's all retroactively corrupt or something?
That's a long answer. And it's not just one system, right? There's so many different aspects to it. You've got distributed systems, consensus algorithms, smart contracts, cryptography, right? And all those things have their own unique, specific
life cycles
that you want to maintain and pay attention to. I think what's really interesting about the public markets is that they've demonstrated that at the core, the concept is actually quite secure. Mm-hmm. And it's built with the same technologies, right? Mm-hmm. So now you take those technologies and you port them into a hyperledger environment, and you've got those qualities. And as Amber mentioned earlier, in the Quorum example, it's actually getting the value of the upstream open source code as well, from a maintenance perspective. Software bugs are part of the business, right? They're not going away because of this new thing. And forking is actually, if you look at forking in one way, it seems bad, but if you look at it in another way, it's actually a value proposition, right? So it depends, there's a whole life cycle of things that have to be managed from a technical perspective here.
I think the other thing is, at least from a Hyperledger perspective, it was built to be modular and pluggable. So as new types of technology, as new consensus algorithms come in, as new databases, et cetera, start to come in, you're going to actually be able to pull them into the technology, which will start to give you kind of some of that future proofing. It's not perfect, that's still very much work in progress, but that was part of the thinking behind it, because I think Gartner often says, the blockchain technology, is still evolving, the one that will win is actually not even existing yet. And I think it's having that ability to pull in the best pieces from across the open source community that's critical.
And I think that's actually a really very good point, is, as we look at the biggest challenge in the market, it's the separation of concerns between your business logic and the ledger is actually quite important. And you just think about how long it took us to put in place ERP systems in businesses, and that's the business logic layer. You want to make sure that if the underlying technology is changing frequently and churning, and you want to always take advantage of the latest and greatest, not to be stuck at having to recode your business logic every time the ledger changes. So that's a very important point as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think on that we're going to end then. I want to thank our panel participants.